The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Alina Rodriguez stepped onto her front porch, her weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. At 62, she had learned to appreciate these quiet moments before the day began in earnest. The mountain air was crisp and clean, carrying with it the scent of pine and the distant sound of her horse, Thunder, nickering softly in the pasture below. Alina's small ranch sat nestled in a valley surrounded by towering peaks, a place she and her late husband Miguel had carved out of the wilderness 35 years ago. Back then, they had been young and full of dreams, planning to raise horses and children in this peaceful corner of the world. Life had different plans. The children never came, and Miguel had been taken by cancer 3 years ago, leaving Alina alone with nothing but memories and Thunder, the last of their once proud herd. Thunder was more than just a horse to Alina. He was a magnificent stallion, coal-black with a white star on his forehead, descended from a line of mountain horses known for their speed and endurance. Miguel had trained him personally, and the bond between horse and rider was something that transcended mere ownership. Thunder seemed to understand Alina's moods, offering comfort when grief overwhelmed her, and providing purpose when the loneliness threatened to consume her completely. The ranch itself told the story of better times. Weathered fence posts marked boundaries that had once contained dozens of horses. The barn, though well-maintained by Alina's careful hands, seemed too large for its single occupant. The riding arena where Miguel had once trained their stock now served as Thunder's playground, where Alina would spend hours each day working with him, maintaining the connection that kept them both grounded. Alina had managed to keep the ranch going through sheer determination and careful financial planning. Miguel's life insurance had helped, but it was nearly depleted now. She took on odd jobs in town, cleaning houses, helping at the local diner during busy periods, anything that would bring in a few extra dollars without requiring her to be away from Thunder for too long. The townspeople respected her quiet dignity and fierce independence, though many worried about the elderly woman living alone so far from help. The isolation that had once been a blessing now felt more like a burden. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and the winding mountain road that connected her property to the main highway could be treacherous, especially during winter months. Alina had grown accustomed to self-reliance, fixing her own equipment, maintaining the property, and handling emergencies that would send most people running for help. On this particular morning, as Alina watched Thunder graze peacefully in the morning light, she had no idea that her world was about to be turned upside down. The tranquility of the scene belied the storm that was approaching, carried not on mountain winds, but in the hearts of men who saw opportunity in an old woman's vulnerability. As she finished her coffee, Alina noticed a dust cloud rising from the direction of the main road. Visitors were rare, and she felt a familiar knot of anxiety form in her stomach. Living alone had taught her to be cautious of unexpected guests. She watched as a black pickup truck wound its way up her private drive, followed by another vehicle. The trucks came to a stop near her front gate, and 4 men climbed out. Alina didn't recognize any of them, which was unusual in a small mountain community where everyone knew everyone else. They were dressed in expensive clothes that seemed out of place in the rural setting, polished boots, designer jeans, and jackets that cost more than Alina made in a month. The leader of the group was a man in his 40s, tall and lean with cold eyes and a smile that never reached them. He introduced himself as Marcus Webb, claiming to represent a development company interested in purchasing mountain properties for a luxury resort project. His companions remained silent, their eyes constantly scanning the property with the calculated gaze of men evaluating assets. Alina listened politely as Webb explained their offer, though something in his manner set her teeth on edge. He spoke of progress and opportunity, of the chance for her to retire comfortably in town, while their company transformed her underutilized land into something profitable. The numbers he quoted were substantial, more money than Alina had ever seen at one time, but there was something in his tone that suggested the offer was not really an offer at all. When Alina politely declined, explaining that the ranch was her home and she had no intention of selling, Webb's demeanor changed subtly. The smile became more forced, the words more carefully chosen. He mentioned the challenges of maintaining such a large property at her age, the isolation, the potential dangers of living alone so far from help. His meaning was clear even as his words remained superficially respectful. Thunder had approached the fence during the conversation, his intelligent eyes fixed on the strangers. Alina noticed how the horse's ears were laid back slightly, a sign of distrust that she had learned to respect over the years. Animals, she had found, were often better judges of character than people. Webb's attention turned to Thunder, and Alina saw something predatory flicker in his expression. He asked about the horse with casual interest, commenting on the animal's obvious quality and bloodline. When Alina mentioned that Thunder was not for sale under any circumstances, Webb simply nodded and smiled that cold smile again. After the men left, Alina found herself deeply unsettled. There had been something threatening about Webb's parting words, a suggestion that they would be in touch again soon. She spent the rest of the day checking and double-checking the security of her property, making sure gates were locked and the barn was secure. That night, Alina lay awake listening to the sounds of the mountain. Every creak of the house, every distant sound carried on the wind made her jump. She found herself getting up repeatedly to check on Thunder, who seemed as restless as she was. The horse paced his stall, nickering softly when he saw her, as if he too sensed that something was wrong. The next few days passed without incident, and Alina began to hope that Webb and his associates had moved on to easier targets. She fell back into her routine, working with Thunder each morning and afternoon, maintaining the property, and trying to push the unsettling encounter from her mind. It was on a Thursday evening, as autumn painted the mountains in brilliant shades of gold and red, that Alina's world shattered. She had been in the house preparing dinner when she heard Thunder's distressed neighing from the barn. The sound sent ice through her veins. It was unlike any sound she had ever heard him make, filled with fear and fury. Alina rushed outside to find 3 figures in dark clothing attempting to load Thunder into a horse trailer. The stallion was fighting them with everything he had, rearing and striking, but they had managed to get a halter on him and were using cruel methods to force his compliance. One man held a cattle prod while another yanked viciously on a lead rope. Without thinking, Alina grabbed the shotgun she kept by the back door and ran toward the barn, screaming for them to stop. The men looked up in surprise. They had clearly not expected her to return so early. For a moment, everyone froze in a tableau of confrontation. Then Webb stepped out from behind the trailer, that same cold smile on his face. He explained calmly that Thunder was now his property, payment for debts Alina allegedly owed his company for property assessments and legal fees. He produced official-looking documents that Alina couldn't read in the dim light, papers that supposedly gave him legal claim to her horse. Alina knew the documents were forgeries, but Webb's companions moved to flank her as she held the shotgun with trembling hands. She was vastly outnumbered, and they seemed unconcerned by her weapon. Webb suggested that she put the gun down and accept the situation gracefully, warning that resistance would only make things more difficult for everyone involved. The sound of Thunder's distressed calls filled the evening air as the men renewed their efforts to load him. Alina watched in horror as they used increasingly brutal methods to force the stallion into the trailer. Every instinct screamed at her to fight, to protect the last connection she had to Miguel and their life together, but the cold reality of her situation held her frozen. When Thunder finally disappeared into the trailer and the vehicles drove away into the gathering darkness, Alina sank to her knees in the dirt of her own driveway. The silence that followed was deafening, no gentle nickering from the barn, no soft sounds of a large animal moving in his stall, just emptiness and the whisper of wind through the pines. Alina remained there for a long time, the shotgun forgotten beside her as tears streamed down her weathered cheeks. She had lost everything now, Miguel, their dreams, and finally Thunder. The ranch felt hollow and lifeless, a shell of what it had once been. But as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, something began to kindle in Alina's chest. It started as a small flame of anger and grew steadily stronger. These men thought they could take advantage of an old widow, steal what was most precious to her, and face no consequences. They thought her age and isolation made her powerless. They had made a terrible mistake. Alina slowly stood and walked back to the house, her mind already beginning to work. She knew these mountains better than anyone, having spent 35 years exploring every trail, every hidden valley, every secret path. She knew where a horse could run and where vehicles couldn't follow. Most importantly, she knew that Thunder would remember his training and respond to her even after being stolen. As she sat at her kitchen table in the lamplight, Alina began to plan. Webb and his men had taken Thunder, but they didn't understand what they had really stolen. They had taken a piece of the mountains themselves, a horse bred and trained for this rough country. More than that, they had awakened something in Alina that had been dormant since Miguel's death, a fierce protectiveness, and a will to fight that surprised even her. The old widow they thought they had victimized was about to show them exactly what kind of woman it took to survive alone in the mountains for 3 years. Thunder was coming home, and she would move heaven and earth to make it happen. Elena opened an old wooden chest that had sat untouched in her bedroom closet since Miguel's death. Inside, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth, was her husband's service revolver from his time as a sheriff's deputy, along with boxes of ammunition and other items she might need. At the bottom of the chest was a detailed topographical map of the entire mountain region, marked with notations in Miguel's careful handwriting showing every trail, every water source, every place where a person could hide or make a stand. As Alina spread the map on her kitchen table and began to study the routes Webb's men would likely take, she felt Miguel's presence beside her. He had trained her well during their years together, teaching her not just how to handle horses but how to track, how to move silently through the forest, how to survive in conditions that would defeat most people. She had thought those skills would never be needed, but now they might be all that stood between her and losing Thunder forever. The plan that began to form in Alina's mind was audacious and dangerous, requiring her to use every skill she had learned in 35 years of mountain living. But as she sat there in the lamplight, studying the map and loading the revolver with steady hands, Alina felt more alive than she had since Miguel's death. Thunder was out there somewhere, probably confused and frightened, surrounded by men who saw him only as a commodity to be sold. But Alina knew her horse, knew his heart and his spirit. He would be waiting for her, ready to run when the time came. The mountains held many secrets, and tomorrow Alina planned to use every one of them. Webb and his men thought they had won, but they were about to learn that some things, love, loyalty, and the bond between a woman and her horse, could not be stolen, no matter how many legal documents they forged or how many men they brought to intimidate an old widow. The hunt was about to begin, and Alina Rodriguez was no longer the prey. Alina woke before dawn, her body moving with a purpose she hadn't felt in years. The grief and helplessness of the previous evening had crystallized overnight into something harder and more focused. She dressed in her old riding clothes, sturdy jeans, boots that had walked thousands of mountain miles, and a jacket that had weathered countless storms. These were the clothes of a woman who belonged in the wilderness, not the helpless widow Webb and his men thought they had robbed. Her first stop was the barn, where Thunder's empty stall hit her like a physical blow. The familiar scent of hay and horse lingered in the air, making his absence even more pronounced. But Alina forced herself to focus on what she needed rather than what she had lost. She gathered equipment from the tack room, a lightweight saddle, bridles, rope, and the emergency supplies she always carried when riding in remote areas. From the house, she collected the items from Miguel's chest, along with food, water, and a first aid kit. Everything went into a pack designed for extended backcountry travel. Alina moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades preparing for mountain emergencies, though she had never imagined she would be preparing to track down horse thieves. As the sun began to rise over the peaks, Alina locked her house and began following the tire tracks left by Webb's vehicles. The men had made no effort to hide their trail, confident in their legal facade and Alina's apparent helplessness. The tracks led down her drive to the main road, then turned toward the highway that wound through the mountains toward the city. But Alina didn't head for the main road. Instead, she struck out across country, following game trails and paths that existed only in the memory of someone who had spent decades exploring these mountains. She knew exactly where Webb's convoy would have to go. There was only one road suitable for horse trailers through this section of the mountains, and it followed a route that paralleled several old mining trails Alina knew like the back of her hand. The first few miles were the hardest. Alina's legs, accustomed to daily ranch work but not to mountain hiking, protested with every step. Her breathing came hard in the thin air, and she had to stop frequently to rest. But gradually her body remembered the rhythm of wilderness travel, the steady pace that could cover vast distances without exhaustion. By mid-morning, Alina had reached a vantage point overlooking the highway. She settled behind a screen of pine trees and used Miguel's old binoculars to scan the road below. Her timing was perfect. Within an hour, she spotted Webb's black pickup followed by the horse trailer moving slowly along the winding road. Even at a distance, Alina could see Thunder in the trailer. The stallion was pressed against the back gate, his head high and alert. He seemed unharmed but clearly agitated, probably calling for her though she was too far away to hear. The sight of her horse in captivity sent fresh anger coursing through Alina's veins, but she forced herself to remain calm and observe. The convoy stopped at a truck stop about 5 miles down the road. Alina watched through the binoculars as Webb and two of his men got out to check on Thunder and refuel their vehicles. They moved around the trailer with casual confidence, clearly believing they had gotten away with their crime cleanly. Alina used their stop to her advantage, cutting across country to reach another observation point further along their route. She had to move fast, using every shortcut she knew, but she managed to position herself where she could continue tracking their progress. As she followed the convoy through the day, Alina began to understand their destination. They were heading toward Bear Creek Canyon, a remote area where several abandoned mining claims created a patchwork of private and public land. It was the perfect place to hide a stolen horse while arranging for its sale or transport to somewhere far from the mountains where Thunder belonged. The canyon was also perfect for Alina's purposes. She knew every trail, every hiding place, every water source in the area. Miguel had brought her there many times during their early years together, teaching her the skills that had now become essential to Thunder's rescue. By late afternoon, the convoy had reached a rundown ranch at the mouth of Bear Creek Canyon. Alina watched from a ridge nearly a mile away as Thunder was unloaded into a temporary corral hastily constructed from portable panels. The stallion paced the enclosure, his black coat gleaming in the afternoon sun as he called repeatedly, a sound that carried clearly across the canyon on the mountain air. The ranch buildings were old and neglected, suggesting this was a temporary staging area rather than Webb's permanent base of operations. Alina counted at least 6 men now, including the original 4 from her property. They had weapons and radios, and they moved with the casual efficiency of people who had done this before. But they also moved like city men trying to adapt to rural surroundings. Alina noticed how they stayed close to their vehicles, how they seemed uncomfortable with the vastness of the landscape around them. These were men accustomed to concrete and steel, not granite peaks and endless sky. As darkness fell, Alina worked her way closer to the ranch. The men had set up camp in the main house, with lights blazing and the sound of loud conversation carrying on the night air. They had posted one guard near Thunder's corral, but he spent more time looking at his phone than watching for intruders. Alina settled into a position about 200 yards from the buildings, behind a fallen log that provided perfect concealment. From here, she could see Thunder clearly in the moonlight. The stallion had stopped packing and stood at the far side of his enclosure, his head turned toward the mountains as if he could sense home calling to him. The sight of her horse standing alone in that makeshift prison nearly broke Alina's resolve. Every instinct screamed at her to rush down there, to try an immediate rescue attempt. But Miguel's training held her back. He had taught her patience, the ability to wait for the right moment even when emotion demanded action. Alina spent the night observing, learning the patterns of the guards, noting the layout of the buildings and the terrain around them. She dozed fitfully, waking frequently to check on Thunder and make sure the situation hadn't changed. By dawn, she had a detailed understanding of Webb's operation and the beginnings of a plan. The next morning brought new activity to the ranch. A different vehicle arrived, this one an expensive luxury sedan that looked completely out of place in the rough canyon setting. The man who emerged was clearly Webb's superior, older, better dressed, and carrying himself with the authority of someone accustomed to giving orders. Alina watched through the binoculars as this new arrival inspected Thunder, running his hands over the stallion's legs and examining his teeth like a buyer evaluating livestock. Thunder tolerated the inspection with obvious distaste, his ears pinned back and his body tense with barely controlled hostility. The conversation between Webb and his boss was too distant for Alina to hear, but their body language told the story clearly enough. There was disagreement about something, with Webb gesturing toward the mountains and his boss shaking his head emphatically. Finally, the older man pointed toward Thunder and made a cutting gesture across his throat. Alina's blood ran cold as she realized what that gesture might mean. These men weren't just horse thieves. They were prepared to eliminate evidence if their operation was threatened. Thunder wasn't just stolen property to them. He was a liability that could be disposed of if necessary. The luxury sedan departed after an hour, but its driver's message was clear. Alina had very little time before Thunder's situation became desperate. She could no longer afford to wait for the perfect opportunity. She had to act while her horse was still alive to be rescued. That afternoon, Alina began her approach. She used every skill Miguel had taught her about moving unseen through wild country, working her way down the canyon walls using natural cover and careful timing. It took hours to cover the distance that could have been walked in minutes, but by late afternoon, she had positioned herself less than 50 yards from Thunder's corral. The stallion sensed her presence immediately. His head came up, and his nostrils flared as he caught her familiar scent on the mountain breeze. For a moment, Alina thought he might call out to her, but Thunder was too well trained. He simply moved to the side of the corral closest to her hiding place and stood waiting, his intelligent eyes scanning the brush where she lay concealed. Alina's heart nearly broke at the sight of her horse so close, but still out of reach. She could see the stress of captivity in his posture, the way his coat had lost some of its gleaming health in just 2 days. But she could also see the alert intelligence in his eyes, the readiness to respond when she gave him the signal. As evening approached, Alina finalized her plan. The guards were creatures of habit, rotating their positions at predictable intervals. There would be a window of about 10 minutes when the corral would be unwatched while the guards changed shifts. It wasn't much time, but it would have to be enough. Alina waited until full darkness had fallen before making her move. She approached the corral from the blind side, using a drainage ditch for cover. Thunder tracked her movement without making a sound, positioning himself near the gate as if he understood what was about to happen. The lock on the gate was a simple chain and padlock, easily cut with the bolt cutters Alina had brought. But as she reached for the tool, she heard footsteps approaching through the darkness. One of the guards was making an unscheduled patrol, his flashlight beam sweeping the ground as he walked. Alina pressed herself flat against the earth, hoping the darkness would hide her. The beam passed directly over her position but didn't pause. The guard walked past the corral, checked the other buildings, and returned to the house. But the close call had cost Alina her window of opportunity. The guard's shift had changed while she waited for the patrol to pass. Frustrated but not defeated, Alina settled in to wait for the next opportunity. Thunder remained motionless at the fence, as if he understood the need for patience. Together, they watched and waited through the long mountain night. It wasn't until nearly dawn that Alina got her chance. The guards had grown careless in their confidence, and there was finally a gap in their surveillance. Working quickly but quietly, Alina cut the chain and swung the gate open. Thunder needed no encouragement. He stepped out of the corral and stood beside her, pressing his muzzle against her shoulder in greeting. But freedom from the corral was only the beginning. They were still surrounded by armed men in hostile territory, miles from safety. Alina led Thunder away from the buildings, following the drainage ditch toward the canyon wall. Behind them, the ranch remained quiet, its occupants unaware that their prize had just walked away into the darkness. Alina knew their escape would be discovered within hours, and then the real chase would begin. Webb and his men would use vehicles and radios to coordinate their pursuit, advantages that Alina couldn't match. But she had something they didn't understand: knowledge of country where vehicles couldn't go and radios couldn't reach, where a woman and her horse could disappear like smoke in the mountain wind. As they reached the base of the canyon wall and began climbing toward the high country, Alina felt Thunder's excitement building. The stallion could smell home on the mountain air, could feel the familiar rock and earth beneath his hooves. This was his element, the terrain where he had been born and trained. Behind them, the first light of dawn was beginning to touch the peaks. Soon, very soon, angry shouts would ring out from the ranch as Webb discovered their escape. The chase Alina had been planning would finally begin in earnest. But for now, in the quiet moments before discovery, Alina allowed herself to feel the joy of reunion. Thunder was free, they were together again, and ahead of them lay the vast wilderness of their mountain home. Whatever came next, they would face it as they had faced everything else, together, with the sure knowledge that some bonds could never be broken by force or fraud. The mountain wind carried the scent of pine and granite, of freedom and home. Alina mounted Thunder bareback, feeling his familiar strength beneath her as they climbed toward the high passes where no vehicle could follow. The real test was about to begin. The first angry shouts erupted from the ranch just as Alina and Thunder reached the rim of Bear Creek Canyon. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, confirming Alina's worst fears. Their escape had been discovered much sooner than she had hoped. Through the growing daylight, she could see men running between the buildings, their voices carrying clearly in the thin mountain air as they organized search teams. Alina urged Thunder forward along a game trail that hugged the canyon rim. The stallion responded eagerly, his powerful stride eating up the rocky ground with an ease that spoke of countless hours training in similar terrain. But even as they moved away from immediate danger, Alina could hear engines starting below. Webb and his men were mobilizing every vehicle they had for pursuit. Within minutes, the first truck appeared on the ranch road, racing toward the canyon mouth where it connected to the highway system. Alina watched from her high vantage point as other vehicles spread out, taking different routes through the lower country. Webb's men were casting a wide net, trying to cut off every possible escape route that led back toward civilization. But Alina had no intention of heading toward civilization. Instead, she turned Thunder toward the heart of the wilderness, following trails that existed only in the memory of old-timers who had explored this country before roads and GPS systems made navigation easy. These were paths known to hunters and prospectors from generations past, routes that appeared on no modern maps. The immediate advantage belonged to Thunder. The stallion had been bred for this terrain, his bloodline tracing back to horses that had carried miners and cattlemen through these same mountains a century ago. His hooves found secure footing on surfaces that would challenge an experienced hiker, and his breathing remained easy even as they climbed toward the high passes. Alina felt the familiar rhythm of partnership returning as they rode. It had been 3 years since she had needed to truly test Thunder's abilities, but the stallion responded to her seat and hands as if no time had passed at all. Miguel's training showed in every movement, every subtle communication between horse and rider that allowed them to move as one through the difficult terrain. By mid-morning, they had reached an elevation where the pursuing vehicles could no longer follow. The roads ended far below, replaced by trails too narrow and steep for anything except horses or pack animals. Alina allowed herself a moment of satisfaction as she heard the distant sound of engines being pushed to their limits on impossibly rough ground, then falling silent as Webb's men reached the end of their mechanical advantage. But Alina knew the respite was temporary. Webb had resources she could only guess at, and men like him didn't give up easily when faced with defiance from someone they considered inferior. Soon enough, the pursuit would continue on foot, with tracking dogs and modern equipment that could make life difficult even for someone who knew the country as well as Alina did. From her position on a rocky outcrop, Alina could see movement in the valley below. Webb's men had established what looked like a command post near the end of the last road, with vehicles arranged in a defensive circle and men setting up equipment that glinted in the morning sun. Through Miguel's binoculars, she could make out radio antennas and what appeared to be maps spread on the hoods of trucks. The sight sent a chill through Alina's heart. This was not the disorganized scramble of amateur criminals caught off guard. These men were adapting quickly to the situation, bringing professional skills and resources to bear on the problem of tracking one old woman and her horse through terrain they didn't know. Alina urged Thunder higher into the mountains, following a trail that switchbacked up a steep slope toward a pass she had crossed many times with Miguel. The path was treacherous, with loose rock and sections where it seemed to disappear entirely, but Thunder navigated it with the confidence of a mountain goat. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit had faded to occasional distant shouts echoing off the canyon walls. As they climbed, Alina's mind raced through the geography ahead. She knew these mountains contained countless hiding places, caves, thick forest, hidden valleys where a horse and rider could disappear for days or weeks. But she also knew that hiding indefinitely was not a solution. Webb's men could afford to wait her out, surrounding the wilderness areas and cutting off her eventual return to civilization. What Alina needed was not just escape, but proof of Webb's crimes that would end his operation permanently. The forged legal documents he had shown her were sophisticated enough to fool casual inspection, which meant Webb had resources and connections that went far beyond simple horse theft. He was part of something larger, more organized, and more dangerous than Alina had initially realized. By noon, Alina and Thunder had crossed the high pass and descended into a valley that few people had seen in the past decade. The trail here was even fainter, marked only by occasional cairns left by long-dead prospectors and the subtle signs that Alina had learned to read during her years with Miguel. This was country where a person could truly disappear if they knew how to live off the land. Alina called a halt near a small stream that bubbled down from the snowfields above. Thunder drank deeply while she refilled her water bottles and considered their options. The stallion seemed to be enjoying the adventure, his ears pricked forward and his step light despite the challenging terrain they had covered. This was the kind of work he had been born for, and it showed in every line of his powerful body. While Thunder grazed on the sparse mountain grass, Alina climbed to another vantage point where she could observe their back trail. For a long time, she saw nothing except the vast emptiness of the high country. Then, just as she was beginning to hope they had lost their pursuers, she spotted movement far below. 3 men were following their trail on foot, moving with the steady pace of experienced trackers. Even at a distance, Alina could see they were better equipped than she had expected: proper hiking gear, what looked like GPS units, and at least one rifle that she could make out clearly. These weren't the same city men who had stolen Thunder. Webb had brought in specialists for the pursuit. Alina felt her stomach tighten with the realization of what she was truly up against. These men were professionals, probably hired from security companies that provided services to people wealthy enough to enforce their will through violence. They would be skilled in tracking, comfortable in wilderness conditions, and completely ruthless in completing their mission. Thunder sensed her tension immediately, raising his head from grazing to study her face with intelligent eyes. Alina forced herself to project calm confidence, but inside her mind was racing through scenarios and options. They could continue deeper into the wilderness, but eventually they would reach country so remote that even Thunder's stamina would be tested. They could try to circle back toward civilization, but that would mean facing whatever roadblocks Webb had established on the approaches to the mountains. Or they could do something completely unexpected. As Alina studied the terrain ahead, an audacious plan began to form in her mind. Instead of running from Webb's men, she could use her knowledge of the country to turn the tables on them. There were places in these mountains where the pursuer could easily become the pursued, where experience and local knowledge mattered more than equipment and numbers. The plan that crystallized in Alina's thoughts was dangerous beyond anything she had ever attempted. It would require her to use every skill Miguel had taught her, every trick of mountain survival she had learned in 35 years of wilderness living. But it was also their best chance of ending this chase on terms that favored the defender rather than the aggressor. Alina remounted Thunder and began riding toward what appeared to be a dead-end canyon, a place where the pursuing trackers would expect her to become trapped. But Alina knew something they didn't. The canyon contained an ancient mining tunnel that connected to a network of passages running deep into the mountain. Miguel had explored those tunnels with her years ago, mapping them carefully and showing her how they could provide shelter in emergencies. More importantly, the tunnels had multiple exits scattered across several miles of mountainside. Alina could enter the mine through one opening and emerge from another, completely confusing any pursuit and giving her the opportunity to get behind Webb's men while they searched fruitlessly through the underground maze. As they approached the canyon mouth, Alina could see her pursuers had gained ground. The 3 trackers were now close enough that she could make out details of their equipment and movement. They were good, better than she had hoped, but they were following a trail that was about to disappear completely. Alina guided Thunder into the canyon, following what appeared to be a natural trail toward the rock face at its head. To anyone watching from a distance, it would look like she had made a fatal error, trapping herself in a box canyon with no escape route. The trackers would assume they had her cornered and would approach with the confidence of hunters closing in on trapped prey. They had no idea that the cornered prey was about to vanish completely. The mine entrance was concealed behind a screen of brush and fallen rocks, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Alina dismounted and led Thunder through the narrow opening, feeling the familiar chill of underground air as they entered the tunnel system Miguel had shown her decades ago. Inside the mountain, lit only by the flashlight Alina had brought in her pack, the tunnels stretched away into darkness. The main passage was wide enough for Thunder to walk comfortably, carved from solid rock by miners who had followed veins of silver and gold deep into the mountain's heart. Side passages branched off in all directions, creating a maze that had swallowed more than one exploring party over the years. But Alina knew these tunnels, had walked them with Miguel until she could navigate them by memory even in complete darkness. She led Thunder confidently through passages that twisted and turned through the mountain's core, heading for an exit that would put them miles from where the trackers expected to find them. Behind them, she could hear the faint echoes of voices as Webb's men discovered the mine entrance. Their shouts bounced off the tunnel walls, distorted by distance and the acoustic peculiarities of underground spaces. Alina smiled grimly as she listened to their confusion, knowing they faced the choice of following her into unknown tunnels or waiting outside and risking her escape through one of the other exits. Thunder moved calmly through the underground passages, his hooves ringing on the stone floor with a rhythm that echoed from the tunnel walls. The stallion trusted Alina completely, following her lead even in this alien environment so different from the mountain meadows where he was most comfortable. After an hour of careful navigation through the tunnel system, Alina began to see the faint glow of daylight ahead. The exit she had chosen emerged high on a mountainside several miles from the canyon where they had entered, concealed by overhanging rocks and positioned to give her a commanding view of the surrounding country. Alina led Thunder out of the tunnel and into the afternoon sunlight, both of them breathing deeply of the clean mountain air after their time underground. From their new position, she could see across several valleys to where Webb's command post still operated near the end of the road. Through the binoculars, she could make out figures moving around the vehicles, but at this distance, she couldn't determine if they knew about her tunnel escape or were still waiting for reports from the tracking team. What Alina could see clearly was the pattern of Webb's operation. More vehicles had arrived during the day, creating what looked like a small military encampment at the base of the mountains. Men with radios coordinated movements across the lower country, establishing a perimeter that would prevent her from returning to civilization by any conventional route. But Alina was no longer thinking conventionally. The tunnel escape had given her more than just freedom from immediate pursuit. It had given her a new perspective on the situation. Webb and his men were operating with the assumption that she was running scared, trying to escape with her stolen horse and hide until the heat died down. They had no idea that Alina Rodriguez was no longer running away from anything. She was coming for them, and she had every intention of ending this chase on her own terms. As evening approached and shadows began to lengthen across the mountain slopes, Alina prepared for the next phase of her plan. Thunder had rested and grazed during their stop, and both horse and rider were ready for whatever the night might bring. Far below, the lights of Webb's camp began to twinkle in the gathering darkness, creating a target that Alina could see clearly from her elevated position. The men down there thought they were hunting an old woman who had gotten lucky and escaped temporarily into country they could learn to navigate with enough time and resources. Tomorrow they would learn how wrong they were. Alina had been patient long enough, careful long enough, defensive long enough. The time had come to take the fight to Webb and his men, to show them exactly what kind of opponent they had chosen when they decided to steal Thunder from Alina Rodriguez. Alina spent the night watching Webb's camp through the binoculars, studying the patterns of movement, the changing of guards, and the general layout of their operation. What she saw convinced her that these men were more dangerous than she had initially realized. The camp was organized with military precision, complete with perimeter guards, communication schedules, and what appeared to be sophisticated tracking equipment. But organization also meant predictability, and Alina had spent enough time with Miguel to understand how such operations worked. There would be a command structure, communication protocols, and standard procedures that could be turned against them by someone who understood their weaknesses. As dawn approached, Alina noticed increased activity in the camp below. Vehicles were being prepared, equipment loaded, and teams organized for what was clearly going to be a major search effort. Through the binoculars, she could see maps being spread on vehicle hoods and pointing gestures that suggested they were planning to expand their search into areas they had previously ignored. Webb himself was visible in the center of the activity, issuing orders with the confidence of a man accustomed to having his commands followed without question. Alina studied his face through the magnified view, memorizing every detail of the man who had invaded her home and stolen her horse. There was something cold and calculating in his expression that went far beyond simple greed. This was a man who enjoyed the exercise of power over those he considered weaker than himself. Alina mounted Thunder as the sun cleared the peaks, feeling the familiar strength and responsiveness of the stallion beneath her. They had been partners for so many years that communication between them had become almost telepathic, each understanding the other's intentions with minimal signals. Today, she would need every bit of that partnership for what she planned to do. Instead of heading deeper into the wilderness as Webb's men would expect, Alina began working her way around the perimeter of their search area. She used every piece of cover the mountain terrain provided, moving through dense forest, following ridge lines, and utilizing the natural camouflage that came from a lifetime of observation and practice. Alina's destination was a place she and Miguel had discovered during their early years in the mountains, a hidden valley accessible only through a narrow pass that was invisible unless you knew exactly where to look for it. The valley contained an old prospector's cabin, long abandoned but still sound, along with a natural corral formed by rock walls and a spring-fed stream. It was the perfect place to leave Thunder while she continued her mission on foot. The journey to the hidden valley took most of the morning, requiring careful navigation through terrain that would challenge even an experienced mountain horse. But Thunder handled every obstacle with the grace and power that had made him legendary among the local horsemen who still remembered Miguel's training methods. As they entered the valley through the concealed pass, Alina felt a moment of perfect peace. This place had always been special to her and Miguel, a secret sanctuary where they could escape from the world and simply enjoy each other's company. The cabin still stood exactly as they had left it years ago, weathered but solid, surrounded by the kind of natural beauty that made all of life's struggles seem worthwhile. Alina settled Thunder in the natural corral, making sure he had access to grass and water. The stallion seemed to understand that this was a temporary separation, nuzzling her shoulder affectionately, but showing no signs of the anxiety he might have displayed in unfamiliar surroundings. This valley felt like home to both of them. With Thunder safely hidden, Alina began the most dangerous part of her plan. She cached most of her supplies in the cabin but kept Miguel's service revolver, extra ammunition, rope, and basic survival gear. Her objective now was not escape but intelligence gathering. She needed to get close enough to Webb's operation to understand exactly what she was dealing with and find evidence that could expose their crimes to the authorities. Alina's approach to the enemy camp required her to cover several miles of rough country on foot, using skills Miguel had taught her for moving undetected through wilderness areas. She traveled during the heat of the day when visibility was reduced by heat shimmer and when Webb's men would be less alert after a night of searching. By late afternoon, Alina had positioned herself on a ridge overlooking Webb's expanded camp from a distance of about half a mile. The operation had grown significantly since the previous day, with additional vehicles, more personnel, and what appeared to be professional tracking equipment including drone aircraft and radio direction-finding gear. Through careful observation, Alina began to understand the scope of Webb's criminal enterprise. This was not just about stealing one horse from one old woman. It was part of a larger operation targeting valuable animals throughout the region. She watched as other stolen horses were brought into a temporary holding area, animals that she recognized from local ranches and breeding farms. The evidence Alina needed was there in the camp, but getting to it would require her to penetrate a perimeter guarded by armed men who had proven themselves competent and dangerous. As she studied the layout through the binoculars, Alina began to formulate a plan that was audacious in its simplicity. Webb's greatest strength, the professional organization of his operation, could also be his greatest weakness. Military-style operations relied on communication, coordination, and the assumption that orders came from legitimate authority. If Alina could disrupt their communications and create enough confusion, she might be able to turn their own efficiency against them. As darkness fell, Alina began her approach to the perimeter of Webb's camp. She moved with the patience of a hunter, using terrain features for concealment, and timing her movements to avoid the patrol routes she had observed during the day. Every skill Miguel had taught her about wilderness survival now became essential to avoiding detection by men who were undoubtedly skilled in pursuit and capture. Alina's first objective was the communications equipment she had observed at the center of the camp. If she could disable their radios and possibly their vehicles, Webb's men would lose the coordination advantage that made them so effective. Without communication, they would be reduced to individuals operating in unfamiliar territory against someone who knew every rock and tree. The approach took hours, with Alina covering the final few hundred yards at a pace that would have frustrated a racing snail. But patience was rewarded when she reached a position less than 50 yards from the main command area without triggering any alarms. The guards were alert but predictable, following patrol routes that left brief gaps in their coverage. Alina waited until the early morning hours when human alertness was naturally at its lowest before making her move. She approached the communications equipment during a gap between patrols, working quickly to disable the radio antennas and sabotage the electrical systems of several vehicles. Her ranch maintenance experience served her well as she located ignition wires and cut them cleanly, creating problems that would take time to diagnose and repair. But Alina's most important target was the collection of documents she had observed in Webb's command vehicle. These papers would contain the evidence needed to expose his entire operation to law enforcement. Getting to them required her to approach the most heavily guarded area of the camp, where Webb himself was sleeping. Alina had noticed that Webb kept a briefcase chained to his wrist even while sleeping, a level of security that suggested the documents inside were critical to his operation. If she could photograph those documents with the small digital camera she carried, she would have evidence that could end Webb's criminal enterprise permanently. The approach to Webb's vehicle required Alina to crawl through a drainage ditch that ran along one side of the camp. The ditch provided concealment, but also trapped her in a confined space where discovery would mean almost certain capture. Alina forced herself to move with deliberate calm, fighting the urge to rush that could lead to noise or careless mistakes. Webb was sleeping in the back of his pickup truck, the briefcase secured to his wrist as Alina had observed. Getting close enough to photograph the documents would require her to enter the truck bed itself, working within inches of a man who would probably shoot her without hesitation if he woke up and found her there. Alina studied Webb's sleeping position, noting the rhythm of his breathing and the way his body was positioned relative to the briefcase. She would have one chance, maybe two at most, to open the case and photograph its contents before the risk of discovery became too great. Moving with the care of someone defusing a bomb, Alina climbed silently into the truck bed and approached the briefcase. The lock was complex but not impossible. Miguel had taught her lock picking during their early years when they occasionally needed to access abandoned buildings on their explorations. The briefcase opened with a soft click that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night. Inside, Alina found exactly what she had hoped for: contracts, financial records, and communication logs that detailed a sophisticated horse theft ring operating across multiple states. The evidence was comprehensive enough to bring down not just Webb but his entire organization. Alina photographed page after page of incriminating documents, using the camera's silent mode to avoid any electronic sounds. Each image was potential proof of conspiracy, theft, fraud, and other crimes that would put Webb and his associates in prison for decades. As she worked, Webb stirred slightly in his sleep, causing Alina's heart to nearly stop. She froze completely, not even daring to breathe as she waited to see if he would wake fully. After what seemed like an eternity, his breathing returned to the regular rhythm of deep sleep. Alina finished photographing the documents and carefully closed the briefcase, making sure the lock reset properly. Getting out of the truck bed and back to safety required the same impossible care with which she had approached, but finally she was clear of the immediate danger zone and beginning her withdrawal from the camp. But as Alina reached the drainage ditch that had provided her approach route, she heard voices and movement that indicated her sabotage had been discovered. Shouts were erupting throughout the camp as guards found the disabled vehicles and communications equipment. Within minutes, Webb himself was awake and bellowing orders as his men scrambled to assess the damage. Alina abandoned stealth for speed, racing through the darkness toward the concealed position where she had left her pack and equipment. Behind her, the camp was erupting into chaos as Webb's men discovered the extent of the sabotage and began organizing search teams to find the intruder who had penetrated their supposedly secure perimeter. As Alina climbed toward the ridge line that would take her back to the hidden valley where thunder waited, she could hear vehicles starting and failing as Webb's men discovered the extent of the damage to their transportation. Radio calls produced only static, as the disabled antennas prevented coordination between scattered teams. For the first time since this ordeal began, Alina felt the satisfaction of having struck back effectively against her tormentors. Webb and his men were discovering what it felt like to be hunted by someone who understood the terrain and the tactical situation better than they did. But Alina knew her victory was temporary. Webb had resources and connections that went far beyond what she had seen in the mountain camp. Once he regrouped and brought in additional support, the pursuit would resume with even greater intensity. The evidence Alina now carried could end Webb's operation permanently, but only if she could get it to law enforcement agencies that weren't corrupted by the same influences that allowed Webb to operate with apparent legal immunity. That meant reaching the outside world while avoiding capture by men who now knew they were dealing with a far more dangerous opponent than they had initially believed. As dawn began to break over the mountains, Alina reached the hidden valley where Thunder waited for her return. The stallion greeted her with obvious relief, and Alina felt the same emotion as she pressed her face against his warm neck. They were together again, and she had accomplished something that Webb never expected from an old widow he thought he could intimidate. But the final phase of their ordeal was about to begin, and Alina knew it would test both her and Thunder beyond anything they had ever faced together. Webb would not give up easily, and he now understood that he was dealing with an opponent who could strike back with devastating effectiveness. The hunt was about to become a war, and Alina intended to win it. Alina spent the morning in the hidden valley, carefully reviewing the photographs she had taken of Webb's documents. Each image revealed another layer of the criminal enterprise she had stumbled into, a sophisticated network that stretched across multiple states, involving stolen horses, forged papers, corrupt officials, and connections to organized crime that made her blood run cold. The evidence was overwhelming, but Alina faced a crucial problem. The local sheriff's department included at least 2 names that appeared in Webb's communication logs, men who were clearly receiving payments for their cooperation. Taking her evidence to the wrong person could result in her being delivered directly back to Webb with no hope of rescue. Thunder grazed peacefully in the natural corral, while Alina wrestled with the problem of how to get her evidence to honest law enforcement officers. She had contacts in town, people who had known her and Miguel for decades, but determining who could be trusted with information this dangerous would require careful thought. As Alina studied the documents, one name kept appearing with particular frequency: Agent Sarah Chen of the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force, based in Denver. According to Webb's communications, Agent Chen was leading an investigation into livestock theft rings, and Webb's organization was clearly worried about her activities. If Alina could reach Agent Chen with the evidence she had gathered, it might be enough to bring down the entire network. But reaching Denver from her current position would require Alina and Thunder to cross hundreds of miles of country, much of it through areas where Webb's associates could intercept them. The roads were certainly being watched, and Alina had to assume that Webb's resources extended far beyond the men she had observed in the mountains. Alina's planning was interrupted by the distant sound of helicopters approaching from the direction of Webb's camp. Through the binoculars, she could see 3 aircraft working in a search pattern, their crews undoubtedly looking for any sign of the woman who had humiliated Webb's supposedly professional operation. The hidden valley's concealment was excellent, but Alina knew that systematic aerial search could eventually reveal even the most carefully camouflaged positions. She needed to be ready to move at a moment's notice, and she needed a plan that would get her and Thunder to safety while avoiding the expanding net that Webb was certainly casting across the entire region. As Alina watched the helicopters through the binoculars, an audacious idea began to form in her mind. Webb's men were searching for a fugitive trying to escape their net, but what if Alina did exactly the opposite of what they expected? Instead of running away from the search effort, what if she headed directly toward it? The FBI agent Alina needed to reach was investigating organized crime, which meant she probably had experience with informants and dangerous situations. If Alina could make contact with Agent Chen directly, she might be able to arrange a meeting in circumstances that would protect both of them from Webb's organization. Alina had noticed cell phone towers during her observation of Webb's camp, which meant there was at least limited communication capability in some areas of the mountains. If she could reach high ground with good line of sight to a tower, she might be able to call the FBI directly and arrange to transfer her evidence. But first, she had to get Thunder to a position where they could make that call without being detected by the search helicopters that were methodically covering every square mile of the mountain wilderness. Alina saddled Thunder and led him out of the hidden valley, following a route that would take them higher into the peaks where the terrain became too rough for easy aerial observation. The climb toward the high passes tested both horse and rider to their limits. The trail was little more than a series of ledges connected by steep scrambles over loose rock, but Thunder handled every challenge with the sure-footed confidence of a mountain horse at the peak of his abilities. Alina felt a fierce pride in the stallion's performance. Miguel's training was showing in every step, as Thunder navigated terrain that would defeat most horses. As they climbed, Alina could hear the helicopters continuing their search below, but the sound grew more distant as she and Thunder reached elevations where aircraft operations became dangerous due to altitude and unpredictable mountain winds. By midday, they had reached a position above the tree line where Alina could see for hundreds of miles in every direction. From her new vantage point, Alina could observe the full scope of Webb's search operation. Helicopters, vehicles, and ground teams were covering the mountains with systematic thoroughness, but they were all focused on the lower elevations where most people would logically try to escape. None of them were looking for someone crazy enough to head deeper into the high country where exposure and altitude could kill as effectively as any pursuer. Alina's phone showed weak but usable signal strength from this position. After checking to make sure no aircraft were close enough to spot her, she placed a call to the FBI field office in Denver. Getting past the initial screening took patience and persistence, but finally, Alina was connected to Agent Chen herself. Agent Chen listened with growing interest as Alina described Webb's operation and the evidence she had gathered. The agent's questions were sharp and professional, clearly indicating that Alina's information connected to cases already under investigation. When Alina mentioned specific names from Webb's documents, Agent Chen's voice took on a note of urgency that confirmed the importance of what Alina had discovered. Arranging a meeting required careful coordination. Agent Chen could not simply drive into the mountains without alerting Webb's network, but Alina could not safely leave the high country while the search operation continued below. Finally, they agreed on a plan that would allow Agent Chen to approach under cover of a routine investigation into reports of illegal hunting in the area. Alina would meet Agent Chen at an abandoned fire tower that stood on a peak about 20 miles from her current position. The tower was accessible by four-wheel drive vehicle from the other side of the mountain, but reaching it would require Alina and Thunder to cross some of the most challenging terrain in the entire region. As Alina ended the call and prepared for the journey to the meeting point, she noticed increased activity in the search pattern below. Webb's men had apparently decided to expand their efforts into the higher elevations, with helicopters beginning to probe the passes and ridges where Alina had been traveling. Thunder sensed her urgency as Alina mounted and turned toward their destination. The stallion's ears were pricked forward, and his stride had the eager quality of a horse who understood that the end of their ordeal was finally in sight. Together, they began the most dangerous part of their entire journey, a cross-country route that would take them over terrain where a single mistake could mean death for both of them. The route to the fire tower required Alina and Thunder to cross 3 major passes, each one higher and more treacherous than the last. The first pass was the most dangerous, with a narrow trail that hugged the face of a cliff for nearly a mile. Thunder negotiated the exposure with calm confidence, his hooves finding secure footing on rock ledges that seemed impossibly narrow. As they descended from the first pass into a hanging valley filled with alpine lakes, Alina heard the sound of helicopters approaching their position. She urged Thunder toward a stand of stunted pine trees that offered the only concealment in the stark landscape above timberline. They reached cover just as the first helicopter appeared over the pass they had crossed moments earlier. Alina held Thunder motionless as the aircraft circled their position, its crew clearly scanning the ground for any sign of movement. The stallion stood like a statue, his intelligence apparent in the way he seemed to understand the need for complete stillness. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the helicopter moved on to search other areas. The second pass was even higher than the first, requiring Alina and Thunder to traverse a saddle between 2 peaks where the altitude began to affect even Thunder's mountain-conditioned lungs. But the view from the top was spectacular, showing the fire tower still distant but clearly visible against the sky. Alina could also see a dust plume on the far side of the mountain that probably marked Agent Chen's approach to their meeting point. The descent from the second pass led through a boulder field where Thunder had to pick his way carefully between rocks the size of houses. This was country where a broken leg would be a death sentence, but Alina trusted completely in Thunder's judgment and experience. The stallion chose each step with deliberate care, never rushing despite Alina's growing urgency to reach the meeting point. As they approached the final climb to the fire tower, Alina could see a lone vehicle parked near the base of the tower. Agent Chen had arrived exactly on schedule. But Alina could also see something that sent ice through her veins. Another dust plume approaching from a different direction, moving much faster than any law enforcement officer would travel on such dangerous roads. Webb's men had somehow discovered the meeting point. Whether through intercepted communications or simple tactical insight, they were racing to reach the fire tower before Alina could transfer her evidence to Agent Chen. Alina urged Thunder into a desperate gallop across the last mile of relatively flat ground, knowing that their entire mission now depended on reaching the tower before Webb's forces could intervene. Thunder responded with everything he had, his powerful stride eating up the distance with breathtaking speed. This was the moment when all of Miguel's training, all of Thunder's breeding and conditioning, all of Alina's horsemanship skills came together in perfect partnership. Horse and rider moved as one entity, racing against time and enemies across terrain that would challenge the best endurance horses in the world. Alina reached the fire tower just as Agent Chen was climbing the access ladder to get a better view of the approaching vehicles. Alina shouted for the agent to come down, explaining rapidly that Webb's men had found them and that the evidence transfer had to happen immediately. Agent Chen proved to be exactly the kind of professional Alina had hoped for. Without wasting time on questions or hesitation, she accepted Alina's digital camera and the written notes that summarized the evidence. In return, she handed Alina a phone with a direct connection to FBI headquarters and instructions for emergency contact if anything happened to prevent the evidence from reaching appropriate authorities. As Alina remounted Thunder and prepared to lead Webb's forces away from Agent Chen, the FBI agent grabbed her stirrup and looked up with genuine admiration. "What you've done here," Agent Chen said, "is going to save a lot of people and animals. Thank you for having the courage to do what most people would never attempt." Alina felt a moment of pride that was immediately overshadowed by the approaching sound of vehicles racing up the access road. Webb's men would reach the tower within minutes, and Alina's only chance was to draw their pursuit away from Agent Chen and back into the high country where Thunder's abilities could give them an advantage. Thunder seemed to understand the urgency of their situation. As Alina guided him away from the fire tower and toward the most challenging terrain she could find, the stallion's movement had the flowing power of a horse running for his life. Behind them, the first of Webb's vehicles reached the tower, but Agent Chen and her evidence were already disappearing down the far side of the mountain in her unmarked government vehicle. Alina led the pursuit back into the wilderness, using every trick of terrain and horsemanship she knew to stay ahead of men who were now desperate to capture the woman who had destroyed their operation. But for the first time since this ordeal began, Alina wasn't running scared. She was leading a pursuit toward ground of her own choosing, with the certain knowledge that her mission was already accomplished. The evidence was safe, the authorities had been contacted, and Webb's criminal empire was about to crumble. All Alina had to do now was survive long enough to see justice done and to return home to her ranch with Thunder. As they raced across the high mountain meadows with their pursuers falling steadily behind, Alina felt Miguel's spirit riding beside them. The lessons he had taught her, the skills he had helped her develop, and the bond he had fostered between her and Thunder had all combined to create this moment of triumph. Thunder's hooves drummed against the mountain earth with the rhythm of freedom, carrying them both toward home and the certain knowledge that some things, love, loyalty, and the partnership between a woman and her horse, could never be stolen by force or fraud. They had faced the worst that human greed could offer, and they had emerged victorious through courage, determination, and the unbreakable bonds that connected all the elements of their mountain family. The chase was finally over, and Alina Rodriguez was going home with her horse, her dignity, and her victory intact. Webb and his men could pursue them if they wished, but they would be chasing shadows across country where Thunder could run forever, and Alina knew every secret the mountains held. Justice was coming for the men who had thought they could steal from a widow with impunity. And Thunder was taking Alina home to the ranch where their story had begun, where it would continue, and where the memory of Miguel's love would always guide them safely through whatever challenges the future might bring.